También virtuales por el Colegio Bilingüe Báltico de Veracruz, México. Un aplauso para ellos. ¿Dónde están? Virtual. Para los Innova Schools de Lima, Perú. Yo estuve allá. Un aplauso grande. Pero no se han conectado virtualmente. ¿Qué pasa con la conexión virtual que no los vemos? ¿Estamos viéndonos o no? Vamos a revisar. ¿Estamos bien? ¿Listos? Bueno. El Colegio Bilingüe Oxford de Villavicencio, que creo que va a llegar en cualquier momento. Un aplauso para ellos. Bueno, Colegio Santa Francisca Romana, ¿dónde están? Alcen la mano, señoritas. Bienvenidas. El Colegio Los Nogales, amigo de un coli, ¿dónde están los Nogales? ¿Dónde están? Ah, están llegando. El Gimnasio Los Portales, ¿no han llegado tampoco? El Gimnasio La Montaña, tampoco ha llegado. El Colegio San Jorge de Inglaterra, bienvenidos. El Gimnasio Campestre, que está virtual también, un aplauso para ellos. Y el Gimnasio Los Pinos de Colombia. Y obviamente el Colegio Hacienda Los Alcaparros, estudiantes organizadores de este año. Okay. Entonces vamos a ponernos todos de pie para el himno. Vamos a oír la canción de Alcaparros. Vamos a ver, estudiantes de Alcaparros. ¿Listos? Yo lo voy a intentar también. ¿Listo? Con ánimo.
Hasta
listo, muchas gracias. Sentarse. Se está olvidando el himno. Vamos a ver qué hacemos con eso. Bueno, pues me siento muy honrada de presentar dos personas que vienen a formar parte del grupo de amigos del Colegio Hacienda de los Alcaparros, pero sobre todo del grupo de amigos del GRULAC Junior. So I'm very honored to introduce two persons that become now a group of friends of Colegio Hacienda de los Alcaparros and friends of the GRULAC Junior. Son Olaf Kulke y Cami Norland. Olaf ha venido trabajando con nosotros en un bellísimo proyecto que es de su propia iniciativa y que está desarrollando desde hace varios años en el Departamento de Geografía y Filosofía de la Universidad de Minnesota, y es el proyecto Our People, Our Climate. So Olaf has been working for a few years in the University of Minnesota, developing the project Our People, Our Climate, and this year became to work with us in the same project. He's teaching us how to do it and to engage with the people. La idea principal del Dr. Kulke es iniciar un diálogo entre el norte y el sur sobre el tema de las tierras altas. So Dr. Kulke is connecting this project to Colombia in order to establish a North-South dialogue. Tiene una profesión que a mí me hubiera encantado estudiar y sé que para muchos de ustedes sería maravilloso hacerlo, que es geografía cultural. Y sueña, digamos, con crear, digamos, y establecer muy claramente una serie de, se me olvidó la palabra, entrepreneurship, ¿cómo se dice? Emprendimientos que tengan que ver con lo cultural y con disciplinas académicas que tengan esta mirada, de manera que pueden aprender muchísimo de él. I'm saying that you are a cultural geographer, which is a wonderful profession or thing to do in life, and that you most recently are passionate and advocate for the establishment of cultural entrepreneurship as an academic discipline and practice, and that we are going to learn a lot from you about that. La segunda persona es Cami Norland. Cami trabaja, y lo voy a leer en inglés porque está muy difícil decirlo en español. Dice, is an MA in the Compassionate Experience Organizer of Integrative Resources and co-founder of the Global Elevate Compassion Coalition. Es un poco complejo, pero lo bello de lo que estoy leyendo es que ella trabaja por la salud mental de las personas, la salud mental en las organizaciones, y esa es su mayor experiencia. Y en la conversación que tenía esta mañana con ella, me contaba que es reconocida como un líder bastante fuerte por ser muy apasionada en ayudar a los individuos, a las organizaciones y las comunidades a reconocer su propia resiliencia y a co-crear una mirada, digamos, del bienestar mental de las personas. So I'm saying, Cami, welcome. That I read first, which is a little bit difficult to translate, but I was telling them that over 20 years you had been working in healthcare, and that now you are recognized as a top leader who is passionate about helping individuals, organizations, and communities, and recognize their own resilience and co-create a culture of mental well-being, que creo que después de la pandemia es una gran oportunidad conocer personas como Cami. Un aplauso para ellos de bienvenida, por favor. Quiero, obviamente, antes de que pase todo este evento, pues hacer un reconocimiento pues muy especial a Andrés Torres, que no sé qué se hizo, pero Andrés tiene esa característica de desaparecer a veces. Andrés lleva más o menos 10 años organizando esta experiencia del GRULAC Junior y soltando, digamos, el proceso de organización en los estudiantes para que algún día tengan todo el empoderamiento para hacerlo desde cero ellos mismos. Contamos también con el apoyo de Sofía, que nos hace todos los contactos internacionales y nos ayuda en este proceso de tener este tipo de invitados. Pero bueno, hoy no es el día para que yo hable, sin embargo, quería contarles a los estudiantes. What I did before was recognizing Andrés' work with the kids, organizing the GRULAC, and recognizing Sofia, which helped us on the international part of the school. And even though it's not the day for me to talk, I'm going to say a welcome words. Yo no quiero decir sino lo siguiente. Yo creo que uno no debe actuar asustado ante el cambio climático. Creo que es un error mirar el cambio climático desde el miedo. Lo que creo es que hay que abrazar esa incertidumbre y que hay que poner digamos, una actitud de entender que somos interdependientes con la naturaleza y que en algún momento de la historia de nuestra humanidad se nos olvidó un poco esa interdependencia y que ahora es el momento de recobrarla con una buena actitud, de reconocerla y también de aprender del planeta Tierra sus propias formas de supervivencia y apoyar el planeta Tierra en esas formas de supervivencia. Y para eso estamos, ¿cierto? Estamos en el colegio para facilitar todas las cosas que tengamos que hacer para reencontrarnos en esa interdependencia y para aprender de ella y al aprender de ella crear nuevas formas culturales, nuevas formas de ver las cosas que seguramente irán por lo menos amortiguando o irán creando otras maneras de vivir en el mundo. Entonces, con esas palabras que son optimistas, que buscan que no haya miedo frente a lo que nos está pasando, cada generación ha tenido sus retos grandes, pues les doy la bienvenida al GRULAC, es su espacio, es su tiempo para pensar, son sus soluciones y sus conclusiones. Bienvenidos al GRULAC Junior 2022. So, what I said is that I don't want them to see the climate change as a tragedy, that every generation has their own challenges, and that maybe we forgot in our journey, the humanity forgot that we are interdependent with nature, and that it's time to remember that and to try to recognize in the planet Earth their solutions for the problems that we have now. And that's a day for that, to think about that. So that are my welcome words. Thank you very much.
Good morning. First of all, thank you again for having me here at the school. It's a great honor to be part of GRULAC Junior and to finally be here in Colombia. We've been working on this project that I'm going to share with you today for a bit more than a year, pretty much throughout the pandemic. And this is a project that sort of started out of necessity. I do a lot of work in the Canadian and US Arctic. I'm an Arctic researcher, and one of my passions is to document climate change. And the story that I'm going to start off with today begins with this picture that you can see right here. this is it was taken by a young woman that lives in Iqaluit that was part of the project, Our People, Our Climate. Her name is Carmen Barrio, and she's a young Inuit woman that lives in Canada here. And the story that she was telling about this cemetery is about climate change. Because if you look carefully, the cemetery is on a beach, on a rocky beach. Iqaluit is in the Canadian Arctic. It is on an island called Baffin Island. It is a cemetery that is regularly exposed to tides, so the water rises and lowers on a daily basis. Well, because of climate change, the water is coming closer and closer to the cemetery where her ancestors are buried. So the story that she tells about the cemetery is that climate change is very real for me, because if it continues as it has been, as she has seen it in her lifetime, and she's 22 years old, if it continues as it has been, this cemetery will be underwater in another 10 years. And I will no longer be able to visit my ancestors, because their bodies will have to be moved. The bodies that are buried here are buried in permafrost. They're preserved by the cold. And if the water comes closer, they will have to move the bodies. They will have to move the cemetery. So this is a story that tells you about the personal impact of climate change on individuals that live in the Arctic. All of us, in some way, shape, or form, are impacted by climate change right now. Some environments, however, are changing faster than others. This environment here in the Arctic is the fastest changing. And as I've learned over the last couple of weeks, the Paramos here in Colombia are the second fastest changing ecosystem due to climate change. So one of the reasons why we are working together, why we are collaborating, is because the immediacy, the urgency about climate change that you can see here also applies to you. So the purpose of this project is to answer one question. When it comes to climate change, how do we see it? How do you see it with your eyes on a daily basis, in your environment, around you, at your school, in your city, in your country, and on this planet? So just before we arrived here, I was hearing, for example, about record high temperatures in India that people are experiencing, with unprecedented high temperatures that they've never seen before. And people in that country are used to high temperatures. So we have drastically changing environments across the world, and people are experiencing this, seeing it in different ways. So the project I'm going to be sharing with you today is about how do we see climate change? How do we make it visible to all of us? So the first picture you saw there, that's a visual example, and it's a story about how climate change impacts this young woman, and in a way, all of us. So I'm going to share with you today what this project called Our People, Our Climate is about. It's a partnership, and you can see that GRULAC Junior and Los Acoparos are a part of it, and have been now for almost 2 years. Several of the students from your school have participated in the meetings online with students from the Arctic that are of high school age as well, and also young adults. The project also involves an organization in the Canadian North called West Baffin Eskimo Cooperative, and my university. And it also involves 2 art galleries. The work I'm going to show you today, produced by students like you, has been exhibited at international galleries in Switzerland and in Glasgow last year. And you'll see some of those images. This is also a university partnership. So my university is the University of Minnesota in Duluth, and I've closely worked with the University of St. Thomas and York University in Canada. And then we've worked with communities in the north. Pond Inlet, which you can see here, this is their crest, Clyde River, and then the capital city of Nunavut, which is the self-governing Inuit territory in Canada. That's the city of Iqaluit. So what I'm going to show you today is what we've been doing, what kind of work we have been creating with these students, and how the project is organized, and then you're going to see the results of it. So I'm going to walk you through the curriculum a little bit, the lessons that we've used, and then I'm going to show you the amazing photography, and if we have time, also the short film that was created by students. Because this project is about photography and learning about how to take pictures that document climate change. And it is also about making films about climate change. So the images that you're going to see, including those you have already seen, were exhibited at international galleries. So these students are photography artists right now, the young women in particular in the Canadian North. So the first thing we're going to talk about a little bit is how do we make climate change visible? What are some of the principles of getting that message about climate change across to other people? The second thing I'm going to touch on is professional photography and climate change. And the third thing we're going to address is the documentary filmmaking part, or how to tell a visual story about climate change. And then I'm going to tell you this story that we actually created for this film. So, just to give you a bit of geographic context, the communities that you'll see and the evidence of climate change that I'm going to show you comes from right here on this island of the Canadian North. So this is one of the northernmost islands of Canada, and Iqaluit, the capital city, is right here. About 12,000 people live in Iqaluit. So it's a fairly large city. And you have Pond Inlet and Clyde River here as well. We also worked with students from Cape Dorset, and I have also been here in Arviat, so you may also see some pictures of this region. So it's all around Hudson Bay here and further north in Canada. So again, this is the island that we're talking about right over here. We've also worked with students in Alaska. And we've worked with this group of people here in central Alaska called the Tanana Chiefs. They own about 40% of Alaska. So these are tribes, indigenous tribes in Alaska that are owning this land here. And Alaska, you can see here the size of Alaska compared to the United States. It's the largest state in the Union. And the Tanana Chief occupy this very large territory right here. So I'm going to show you some pictures of the work that I've done before Our People, Our Climate, because I want to give you the context for it and why it matters. So we're talking about communities here that are in remote regions that you can only access by plane. The same thing with all the islands, with the Baffin Island that you saw earlier, and the communities of Iqaluit, Pond Inlet, and Clyde River. You can only fly there. There's no roads. So these are by many means inaccessible communities that are only approachable by plane. This is what the airport in one of these communities looks like. This is the International Airport of Arviat. It has one terminal, and you fly in there. This is me standing in Arviat here. This is May of 2019, so right about this time 3 years ago. And you can see that there's still plenty of snow and ice on Hudson Bay. And that's a good thing. This was a year when there was still lots of ice on the bay. And I'm standing in front of a whaling ship because people in these communities largely still live by subsistence. In other words, they hunt the food they eat. They hunt whale, they hunt seal, they go fishing, and they also hunt primarily caribou as their mainstays of their diet. So what I've done in the Canadian North, especially, is work with students like you on a similar project. So here we are actually out on the ice of Hudson Bay, and we're traveling in these little sleds you can see here, and they're pulled by a snowmobile, or a snow machine right here, and we're out on the ice, we're camping. This is what it looks like when you're in the Arctic. So it's a sea of ice and snow, essentially, that we're traveling across, that people live in. So you can see one woman right here hunting, or actually fishing. See this right here? And here we've set up camp on a hunting trip. And this is us again in our sleds. You can probably guess that this tall guy here is me. So in order to understand the challenges, in other words, that people are facing in the Arctic or anywhere else when it comes to climate change, you have to be there. You have to live with them. You have to understand them from their perspective. You have to really get to know them and build trust with them so that they tell you the stories about the climate change that they're experiencing. So one of the stories, for example, that we heard in Arviat when I was there quite frequently in the Canadian North is that these animals here, which are caribou, that we saw by the thousands, are no longer migrating the same way. They're no longer moving across the ice the same way. They're no longer coming as close to the community as they used to. And that means people have to go further and further out to hunt and to see these animals and to find them. That's dangerous in this kind of environment. The ice is also melting earlier. It becomes more dangerous to travel across this ice to actually hunt the caribou. So in this case here, climate change has a profound economic consequence for this community because this is their main food source. This is what they eat on a daily basis. The vast majority of this food is still hunted, and climate change impacts that. Here we are with a number of youth doing exactly what we've been doing with the other communities here, and what we also want to do with the Acaparos here, and that is take pictures of the climate change that we're experiencing. So what I'm going to share with you today is some of these images of climate change that has been captured by students like you. For example, this is one of the pictures that one of our students took here in the Canadian Arctic, and this is how this is an Inuit elder here. His name is Billy Ukutak, and he's demonstrating how the Inuit used to hunt. So he has a bow and an arrow with him. He's holding that here. And he has a sled. So after he would have killed the animal, he puts it on this sled and then brings it home. Today, what happens is that he goes across the land by snowmobile, and he has a cabin outside of Arviat, and this is his freezer. This is where he keeps his meat away from the polar bears that roam in this area, because it is no longer safe to just kind of leave the meat out there in a wooden shack that he normally has. He has to actually use a bus made out of steel to keep the bears away. So what I want to show you now is how we set up this curriculum and how we designed this program, Our People, Our Climate, and what some of the things are that are part of that yet you will be learning, or that you have already been learning in this school as well. So the central question of this project, like I said, is what are you seeing? What are you actually experiencing when it comes to climate change? What does that look like to you, and how can you visualize that? So when it comes to climate change, of course, one thing we could do is we could take pictures of temperatures, a thermometer, and show, well, today has been the hottest day that we've ever experienced in this town. So this is what we started in the Arctic. We asked them to take pictures of thermometers, specifically warm days in the Arctic. We also asked them to take pictures of the ice and how it's changing. We asked them to document the snow, the soil, and the wildlife, and how that all has been changing for them in the Arctic. So yesterday, we were out in Chingaza National Park with a group of students, and we asked you to document the wildlife, the flowers, the plants, and the animals that you see, and to pay close attention to the landscape around you, and to also ask your Muisca guides how that landscape has changed. This is essentially what we did with the Arctic students as well. So we've been translating the work that we did in the Arctic to what you are doing here and what you are experiencing in Colombia. So let me briefly walk you through the 7 principles of climate change and how you can visualize climate change, or what we ask all of you to pay attention to when it comes to taking pictures of climate change and documenting them. Here's these 7 principles. So the first one is show real people. Yesterday you had the chance, some of you had the chance to interview Muisca guides. And that was the reason for this was because we wanted you to interact with real people that experience climate change in Chingaza National Park. So you can see 2 pictures right here. This is the picture you saw before in one of the slides, and it is a staged photograph. So we actually had Billy Ukutak, the hunter, set up like this. And this is the picture that I took after he was done with his presentation about hunting, where he's actually on his snowmobile and where his meat freezer is here behind him as well. This is a not staged shot. Ideally, what you want to do when you document climate change is to take pictures that are like this, where somebody is doing something that is not staged. The second principle of climate change is to tell new stories. So these are 2 slides here, 2 pictures that you can see. These are from Alaska. And what you see here is a river, and you see erosion. And you can barely see this here because this is really small, but this is a road in Alaska. And this road had collapsed 2 days before we arrived in the community. And it has collapsed because of the water that is rising in this river, because it is warmer. This was one of the warmest days that the community actually had experienced here in Alaska. When we were there, it was 35 degrees Celsius in Alaska in June. So much earlier than it would typically get warm. It was extremely hot. And we also had some Inuit people from the Canadian Arctic with us. And as a consequence of this heat, a lot more water is being released from the permafrost in these cliffs here. So the water simply drains into the river, and then the roads by the river collapse because there's no more ice or water holding them up, holding this land up. So when you document climate change, focus on recent events, things that happened recently, and tell that story. Well, in the Canadian Arctic, one of the things that's changing right now quite drastically is the way energy is used. These are communities that are only accessible by boat in the summer when the ice has melted, and by plane all year round. So they rely on fossil fuels. And these are the fossil fuel tanks here in Arviat, Nunavut on the Hudson Bay. So they're filled once a year when a big oil tanker comes along with fuel, with diesel fuel or with gasoline or both, and drops it off. On the other hand, what you see here in many Arctic communities is that they're increasingly switching to solar energy, which of course is really only usable in the summers to reduce the fossil fuel impact. Because in the winter, in the Arctic, it's mostly dark. So the days are really, really short or non-existent. You have several months of darkness there as well. So in the summer, however, most of the communities now that we visited can be powered by solar power. And this is a shift that's happening in the Arctic. So fossil fuels, of course, are one of the major causes of climate change. We all know that. I think there's not much dispute about that. So we documented the fossil fuel usage in the Arctic here, and also how people are now adapting to renewable energy such as solar. The fourth principle of climate change visualization is to show impacts that are emotionally powerful. And this is a story about food. What you see here is a plane, and what you see here is an energy drink. Y'all familiar with those? Well, when we arrived in one of our communities that we were working with in the Canadian Arctic, an elderly man, about 60 years old, was being evacuated by plane to a hospital 3 hours away in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Why? Because he had consumed, for the first time in his life, one of these energy drinks, and he had heart palpitations. So he was thinking he was having a heart attack. He was fine in the end. The whole community knew about it the next day. But these flights, these evacuation flights, are really, really expensive. And the reason why I'm showing you this and what this has to do with climate change is that more and more people in the Arctic are consuming non-traditional food. One thing about climate change is that we want to highlight with this project is that it's important to eat local foods and traditional foods as much as you can. Because when you import foods that are not natural, or that the diet of these people can typically not handle, something bad can happen. So this was an emotional story. We literally had just arrived at the airport, and there was this big hubbub, and everybody was trying to get this man to the plane as fast as possible. And we heard the story first 10 minutes that we arrived in the community. And so I took pictures of it, of the plane, and later went to the grocery store where you see shelves filled with energy drinks. This is a picture actually from my home country. I'm German by origin. I've lived in the United States about half my life, but this is Passau, Germany in 2013. And these are flood levels, and this is the town hall, it's actually City Hall. So they have marked recent floods, and I had just been there. You can see this is actually water that had just subsided about 5 days before I arrived in Passau. This was the worst flood in 500 years. 500 years. So most of the town was actually underwater, and they were just cleaning up at the time when we arrived. So the fifth principle of climate change is to look at serious effects. Like the cemetery that you saw before, or like a flood that you can see right here. The sixth principle is carefully use protest imagery. Obviously, there have been lots of protests about climate change in the last decade. We have an entire youth movement that was started by Greta Thunberg of Sweden, and students walked out of school. So when you are portraying climate change, it's really important to show the protest imagery, but also to portray it in a positive light, and to always sort of emphasize the positive aspects of that protest. And then the seventh principle is knowing who you are creating the images for. Who's your audience? So the images that you'll see in a minute that our students created were created for the United Nations. They were created for the United Nations Climate Conference, which just happened in November of last year, COP26, which was happening in Glasgow, Scotland. And students contributed those images to it. So I want to show you now some of the photography that we did with the students. So some of the exercises that you have already been doing in your classes, and some of the work that we will be doing, is to sort of think about what was it like in the past and what is going on today. So what's the old world look like and what does the new world look like? This is one of the exercises from the class. We also ask you to portray risk, and the metaphor that we're using for that is to walk on thin ice. In the Arctic, that actually does apply to this environment. What's happening in your environment when it comes to climate change? How do you perceive the risk for your life that comes from climate change? How does it impact you? That is the story we'd like you to tell. And then the third sort of photography exercise that I'll show you the results of is a rising tide raises all ships. And what this metaphor is about is how does a community actually respond to climate change? What are we all doing together to address climate change? So, let me show you what we did in terms of both videography and photography. So here is one of our Inuit filmmakers that we worked with, Eric Anoe, and he's working with students in a lab. He's showing them how to run a camera and to document the climate change in their community. So I interviewed Eric. This is all happening during the pandemic. So we were all on Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever you're using here. And we're doing all this instruction online. So I brought in Inuit filmmakers and we had conversations about how do you create a documentary film. I also worked with one of my former students. His name is J.J. Kelly. He works for National Geographic, a magazine that you may be familiar with. And so I interviewed him. He was in his tiny little apartment in Manhattan in New York City during the pandemic, and he usually travels like 40 weeks a year. And so we had a lot of time to talk about his film work, and the students got the benefit from that. But let me show you some of the results, and then we'll go watch the film. So I'm going to show you the work of 4 students that were part of our project. The first one is Carmen. So here is one of her works that was exhibited in Switzerland and in Glasgow. And this is in response to that exercise which you just saw, out with the old, in with the new. So she specifically took pictures of how solar energy now is used in Iqaluit. But the other thing that I want to draw your attention to is this. This is an actual greenhouse outside in Iqaluit, Nunavut. So somebody is growing vegetables, albeit in a small greenhouse. But this was not possible 10, 15 years ago. Even in the summers, it was too cold to grow any kind of vegetables, even with protection. So she wanted to demonstrate, well, we are using more and more renewable energy, but the climate has changed also so much that we now can grow vegetables in the Canadian Arctic in the summer. This is the picture that I started off with, and you know the story already. So she took a picture here to demonstrate how climate change is impacting her and her relationship with her ancestors. She will no longer be able to visit all of her ancestors once this cemetery is flooded, unless they move the bodies. This is another picture you saw earlier, and this is actually a traditional oil lamp that the Inuit are using, and behind it, you can see sort of very faintly a number of women sitting around the oil lamp. The oil lamp is a traditional tool of the Inuit that they use to heat houses, to cook, and also for light in the winter. The other student that is of your age was Anna Irvin. So what she documented, the story that she told in her climate change essays, was all about fossil fuel energy. So this is one of those oil tankers that drops off all the fuel for the summer here in Clyde River where she lives. This is the small community here. There's about 1,000 people that live there. And she focused on how fossil fuel was everywhere in her community. So here is one of those trucks driving the fuel around in town to the individual houses, because the houses have to be heated by fuel, and each individual person has their own fuel tank. There's no gas lines in the ground or anything like that. You have to provide heat to the house directly by a fuel tank next to your house. You can also see all the exhaust that's coming here out of these houses there from using diesel fuel. Transportation in the Arctic also entirely relies on fossil fuel vehicles. Snowmobiles in the winter, all-terrain vehicles in the summer, and some people have cars. They can afford it. But this is basically the way you get around there. Again, all powered by fossil fuels. Here's people lining up at the gas station in Clyde River in November. And you can see the big fuel tanks there. So everybody that has a car has to come to the community here. She also documented how fossil fuel is actually ever present when it comes to plastic. So these women here are carrying plastic bags home from the grocery store, and she was just appalled as to where plastic bags were everywhere. So there was no renewable bags used, everybody used plastic, and then it ended up on this big trash pile here in her local community. The third student's work that I'm going to show you is Chelsea Kwamanik. And this is one of the stories that she told. This is her partner with whom she has a child, and he's looking out onto the ice. And she said they were out on a walk one day, and he was just starting to talk about hunting again, and said, I wonder if I can take our son hunting here in 15 years from now when he's ready. It's just a little baby at that time when when this picture was taken, but he was essentially wondering if the ice will still be there. And here you see a number of older women in the community teaching the younger women how to skin seals and get the fur off the seals. This is another traditional craft. Another story that has been told through this project is how climate change is impacting gender roles in the Arctic. You might not think that's a big deal, but it is. Many men are the hunters or the providers in the community traditionally, and the women are the ones that process all the meat, process all the food, and do all the sewing with all the seal skin and all the other furs that are available there. So climate change is impacting their daily livelihoods and even traditions that are passed on from generation to generation among women and among men. So here's Chelsea, and this is another one of her pictures with her little son in a traditional sod house. So the past, how they used to live in the Arctic, and where they live now, and how they're using fossil fuels to heat this. So a couple more images so you can see what this looks like. And then the last images are by Kendra King, and this is her fiance, and he's holding a harpoon, or a traditional way in which people used to hunt, and he's holding a machine gun. This is one way they hunt now. So she also documented the tremendous waste of energy and the tremendous waste of material and the problem of trash in the Arctic. How do we deal with that? And how does this all, how is our daily consumption of goods impacting climate change? So this is all documented in her work that you can see here. And she also wanted to show that how people are still practicing sort of traditional ways of building or learning traditional cultures, and this is sort of an igloo building contest where people learn how to build traditional igloos. So this work was actually exhibited in Switzerland at an exhibit called 50 Shapes of Prey by Museum Cerny, which is an Inuit museum. So you can see one of Carmen's images here paired with a polar bear with some Inuit sculpture. You can see it here paired with another local animal, and you can see the other student images here paired with other professional artist work. And then the second outcome was that our students, what this project contributed to an exhibit at the Center for Contemporary Arts in Glasgow. This was all during last year's climate change conference in Glasgow. So here's just a couple of images that sort of show that our People, Our Climate was part of this exhibit. You can see the film was exhibited in one room here, and the gallery was filled with the images of climate change as experienced by our students, and we also have this living on in an online gallery now. If we have time, what I'd like to do is to show you the film that the students also created. It's about 13 minutes long. We have enough time for this. But it's really, really powerful, and this tells the stories of the students. So the next step of our project is to repeating and adapting this work to the work that you do here, replicating this kind of work, and the outcome could be, or should be, that your student work is exhibited globally with international organizations, because you're the next generation that carries that powerful message that climate change is real and that it matters to you. So this is why we want to collect this visual imagery, and why we did that kind of work yesterday in Chingaza as well. So this is the presentation I have. I would just like if we could cue up the film and show the film.
My name is Jacob Jepudi. In Inuktitut, I'm called Jaku, which is the translation of Jacob. And I was born and raised in Clyde River in 1951. I've seen some changes in this climate. The ice used to be much thicker when I was growing up. The average ice thickness used to be around 6 feet, maybe close to 7 feet during winter. Some glaciers where we used to see every year, because this is our annual hunting area where we hunt caribou every summer as we were growing up. One particular area in this fjord, there used to be maybe 20, 30 feet thick of glacier hanging from the cliff, but now it's totally gone. There used to be a lot of seals in this area. Now there's hardly any. It might be due to their diet. Their diet is no longer here. They're dying off.
And fuel is used to just to transport the fuel here. So on top of the whole process of getting the fuel out of the ground and getting the oil and all that extracted, it is then put on a ship where it is transported around the coast up to and around Baffin and then on here to Clyde. And it comes by ship.
My name is Carmen Barrio. I'm from Iqaluit, Nunavut. So my mother was born on the land. They lived in hammocks, they survived off the land. They were living in igloos, what they're calling history, where my mother was surviving off the land, born on the land. And in just a short period of time, we now have homes with greenhouses and solar panels, and just how quickly things have evolved in the north. Just so interesting to see and hear stories from my mom about living on the land and the teachings that she's learned, to now us living in such a modern society where I'm pretty much learning how to live a modern lifestyle with my mother, you know, because this is all new to her as well. So that's a very interesting way to think of it. Why am I not experiencing the weather that I had when I was a child? Why are we not getting as much snow as we used to in the winters? And why is it getting so warm in the summers now? When I think of climate change, I think of the tides rising. And one thing I would always worry about is our grave sites or homes that are closer to the beach, you know, like what kind of losses would we have? And the biggest loss for me would be this graveyard, because I have family buried here. You know, I wouldn't be able to go visit them anymore. There's many uses for the GRULAC. It's a traditional oil lamp that was typically for the woman to light and maintain for the family. They would use the GRULAC, of course, for light. It was a source of heat. Today, a lot of people use it just as a way to kind of bring people together, kind of like an icebreaker for the group. If you're doing a big group, it's a good icebreaker for someone to just sit there, light the GRULAC, do a prayer, if a prayer is something that the group wants, or just do like teachings of the GRULAC, or just to teach traditional knowledge in general. It resembles icebergs melting. It resembles you know, there's places around the world that are having forest fires and stuff, you know, like, so it can interpret so many things for climate change.
My name's John Naudluck. I live in Iqaluit, 20 years old, and I've been living here my whole life. Grew up hunting with my dad. He taught me everything I know now. We'd hunt seals, polar bears, caribou, walrus, anything that we could eat. In the wintertime, we'd take our skidoos, whatever it was, and we'd have a kamutik attached, which is like a toboggan, and we'd bring a dome tent in case there was an emergency and we needed to stop. We bring a canvas tent, which was like a big 5-person tent we just sleep in. A Coleman stove, it's a little portable stove, a cooler full of food, water, toiletries, a bag of clothes, and a sleeping bag. There's a lot more water. I don't know if climate change, but I find that there's a lot more water in the summer. It's a lot deeper. Some of the islands that we used to use as markers aren't there anymore. Like they're completely gone. In the winter, it's a lot more mild. We still get a lot of snow, but it's very, very mild here now. Like I want to learn how to build an igloo, and I want to learn how to live off the land like they did, and I just find that I can't do that as easily as they used to. We can become more efficient with what we use. Natural resources. They were in the talks of bringing windmills here, but for some reason they didn't end up doing it. Inuit do most of their hunting in the wintertime, because that's what most of the year is here. And if that were to deteriorate, a lot of things would change.
That pointy stick that he's holding is known for a harpoon. And his dad actually grew up out on the land. He grew up on an outpost camp called Allen Island. And when he was a kid, they would have to hunt for their own food. And they would go seal hunting with the harpoon. And they would go out into the middle of the ocean in just little kayaks. And they would get so close to the seals that they would have to harpoon them with that stick. Obviously, they don't really use harpoons anymore because guns are more efficient.
We were just walking along the beach and we came across this sod house, imagining that we were in the sod house. There would be a roof covering all the areas, but in this picture, it's covered in half just to see what it would be inside. Looking over the Violet Island, I would think that he's like wondering how he's going to teach his son on how to hunt in the future. There's a mining company just outside of Pond Inlet that mines iron ore, and now we're just worried. It's like jeopardizing the marine mammals with their habitats and their mitigation ways.
Just raise their hand and make a good question to Olaf. So is anybody interested? Any volunteers? Thank you. Okay. So first of all, I think it's wonderful this initiative that you're taking towards educating people on recognizing the effects on climate change on and how humans have deteriorated the Earth's condition and how that is just directly harming us ourselves. But in the presentation, we saw a lot of how you're looking to show these direct effects that many people ignore constantly. But in this project, are you also looking forward to show people how is it that we can change these circumstances, like the solutions we can take or the actions they are already taking towards solving this issue, or only continuing to educate like different target parts of the society for us to do it like ourselves?
The original intent of the project was to really, first and foremost, focus on visualizing, so showing what is and how serious this problem is for our current situation and how serious it could possibly get in the future. You saw some examples here of some potential solutions already, like you know, the use of solar power in the north. And one of the issues with creating this film was that many of the students, this was a student-driven project. So my colleagues and I, we were curriculum advisors. We were teaching classes, but the students did all the work online. They did all the work in the community. They did all the interviews. Every picture, every film you saw, every bit of film you saw was done by students like you. I want to again highlight this. So I'm just a teacher, and they're the ones that provided the evidence that they see in their community. So Chelsea, who was the last one that you heard talking there about the mining company that's near her community, obviously has no access to what's going on, for example, at the mining camp there. And many of these communities are surrounded now by iron mines, gold mines, platinum mines, silicon, all sorts of other things that we specifically need for a modern computer technology taken out of the ground in the Canadian North. So access to the profound situation that many of these communities find themselves and the direct causes of climate change, in many cases, is difficult to get. And there, at least in the Canadian North, there are still very few alternative solutions that are being experimented with. You heard her talking about windmills. This hasn't really been implemented yet. And you saw some solar panels, and it is still very much in its infancy. So in the future, as this project grows, which I hope it still will, we could also focus on these the alternative solutions. And one of the most interesting dialogues that I think we had with the students was about traditional ways versus modern ways. And none of the students that were working with us in the North want to go back to the way the life was 50 or 60 years ago for their parents or their grandparents. They certainly enjoy some advantages of the modern life, although they also see how destructive it is at the same time. So for many of them, it's living with that contradiction of how can we celebrate our traditional ways of living, especially hunting, fishing, and preserve that, but at the same time be part of a modern society. So I'm going to be really blunt. Nobody in the North, and this, I've heard this, I'm not speaking, this is not me saying this really. One thing that I've heard from many, many Inuit is that no one wants to return to living off the land like they used to. They do want to continue that tradition of hunting and fishing, but they also want to enjoy some of the modern conveniences and the safety and security that that provides. The question now is more, how can we do that in more environmentally friendly ways, especially getting away from fossil fuels more efficiently? So I think that's sort of the biggest challenge for the future that this project could document, the alternatives to fossil fuels, especially in environments that are incredibly dependent on them, like the Arctic.
Okay, thank you. And what advice would you give for those who are seeking to make a change in this world as much as you do?
That's a really important question. Um, I'm 50 years old, and my children are 20 and 18 years old. So they are just starting university or finishing high school right now. And especially my daughter is very vocal and very active in sort of climate change initiatives and makes me aware of it. I think I learn a lot from your generation, and I think it's, in a sense, your responsibility to be as vocal as you possibly can. You know, be that protest, be that involved with developing new technologies, be that you could be involved in environmental policy movements. So every one of you has a certain strength. Some of you might be interested in policy, some of you might be interested in engineering, some of you might be interested in sort of really the active politics behind environmental change. So I would say find your strength in that regard and focus on how you can make the biggest possible impact by reaching out to my generation or even my parents' generation to make it clear how serious this is. Some of us are aware of it, but I believe that your generation is acutely more aware of how climate change will impact you in the future than my generation or even my parents' generation.
All right, thank you. Who's the next question over there, I think?
Okay, first of all, thank you for coming in and tell us about your project. I have two questions. The first one is, what did inspire you to make this project, and what are you trying to achieve in the future with this project?
Thank you. What inspired me to work on this project was my experience in the Canadian Arctic and the stories that I've heard from many people. The project that actually led to this project here was a completely different one. We were actually working with communities in the Canadian Arctic on how to build sustainable businesses that do not use fossil fuels, and specifically businesses that focus on digital technology. So one of the biggest environmental factors in the north, in the Arctic, is the fossil fuel cost of transportation and the fossil fuel impact of transportation. Everything has to be flown in and out. So if you're building a business that moves a lot of heavy goods, you have a really big impact on climate. So our original project that we started out with was focusing on how can we build businesses or help people build businesses in the north, in the Arctic, without having such a huge impact on the climate by producing something that can be moved digitally. So video content, photography, or learning how to code, and then doing that kind of work remotely. The Arctic is incredibly well connected digitally when you're thinking about it. So broadband and other internet technology is really widespread. So everybody's connected to the internet, and there's lots of opportunities to utilize that to reduce climate change impacts. But what really inspired me to do the project was the stories I heard from the local people about how life is changing on a daily basis and how unsafe life has become. So I worked with a colleague that had been in the Arctic much longer than I have been, and we heard all these stories about hunters going out on their snowmobiles in May, like this month right now, and in the past it used to be safe to go on the ice and go out to go seal hunting or go caribou hunting. They have to be much, much more careful. So these stories of people getting stranded out on the ice, falling through the ice because it's so much thinner, you hear them all the time. People die because of climate change to simply supply their community with food. So that to me was the biggest factor. What was your second question again? for me, the most important part is the emphasis on the emotional impact. People do things, people change when they're emotionally impacted by a story, especially when they hear it from people that are directly impacted in a certain community. So in the case of the Canadian North, there aren't that many people yet that are producing content that makes us aware of what's actually going on. So it's this raising of awareness, it's the production of content that actually shows you this is real, this is what's going on, this is happening on a daily basis. That's sort of what drives this, and that's what I'm hoping to achieve in the future, that we're just essentially creating a global awareness campaign that, yeah, we started this in the Arctic, but we may as well do a project like this in the Paramos or in Sri Lanka to see ocean level rises and how that impacts different communities. So it's getting these local stories out and giving people the power and the tools to tell that story. And not just professional journalists, but these are, like I said, these are high school students that produce this film. It's putting them in the spotlight. That's really at the heart of it.
Okay, so my question is on the line of the last question. So I wanted to know, well, first of all, what impact was your research have, and but more so, what impact have you already seen or maybe heard of that this project has had on different communities, maybe community you work with, or a community you have interact with? Is this impact the one you were expecting to have, or?
Well, I wish I could tell you about the policy impact that it would have had, but showing this film during the climate conference at the United Nations meeting last November was one way in which we could get the word out about the work that the students are doing. I'm not sure it had a direct policy impact, but this work is now replicating itself sort of in the Canadian Arctic. There are other communities that are picking this work up, so students are eager to tell their stories. And we're actually expanding right now, not just to here, but also to other parts of Canada that are not in the Arctic. So the Inuit, for example, the indigenous people of the North, 40% of them don't live in the Arctic anymore. They live in Winnipeg or Toronto or other large Canadian cities. And the issues that they're facing are even worse in these communities, because many of them are forced out of their communities because of climate change, because it's too crowded. There's not enough housing for them. Many of them come south, but they're not used to the warm weather in the south. And yes, the Canadian North is, is cold, but it's getting warmer. But southern Canada is getting even warmer faster. So many people are mentally impacted by the warm weather, and they're also physically impacted by the warm weather. They literally get sick from the warm weather. And this is so one of the biggest challenges for them. So the idea really is to create more awareness of how people are globally impacted by it. But I have not seen any policy changes. I wish that's the ultimate goal, is to see that your voices can actually be heard at international policy bodies like the United Nations especially. So, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change meets every 2 years. So every 2 years you have the chance to tell a new story, to expand on that story, to build that story, to really drive the point home that climate change matters to your generation. So that's what I hope the impact will be, and this should always be a student-driven project.
All right, thank you so much. Does anybody else have a question, or can we move on? Okay, yes, you. The microphone, please.
How adverse are the economic impacts compared for caring for the environment in Antarctica? The Canadian Arctic.
Did you ask about how significant the impact?
No, I mean, how adverse is caring for the economy compared to caring for the environment?
Oh, It's a really, the conversation about the environment versus the economy is a really delicate balancing act in Canada, because of course, climate change has some positive economic benefits. It makes land more accessible. You know, it makes work easier, especially if you're in mining. We're talking about open pit mining, so open mines that are not underground. You know, it is easier to live there for people now in the north. It's easier to bring miners in. There are not as many snowstorms or blizzards that impact these communities, so it's easy to fly in and out goods. So economically speaking, the Arctic has become much, much more accessible. You know, the Northwest Passage, the shipping route through the Arctic around Canada is now also open longer during the year, so it's easier to move goods. So there is that tremendous potential economic impact, and many indigenous communities up north are also benefiting from it. So tourists, for example, tourist ships, cruise ships, come to the Canadian Arctic more often now. They used to have maybe one a year. One community now has 25, 26 ships landing there every summer. So they bring the tourists on land, they show them the community, they take them out onto the land, they learn about traditional ways of living. So there's a tremendous economic benefit to the weather getting warmer, but at the same time, it does impact the traditional ways of living. And I want to kind of go back to that picture I showed you with the energy drinks. Climate change is profoundly impacting people's diets. And when you think about that, what you consume, the food you consume, not just nourishes your body, but also your mind. So the health impacts of climate change because of the availability of sugar and other southern foods have been absolutely dramatic in the Canadian Arctic. So people have this tremendous rates of diabetes and other sort of civilization diseases that didn't exist there before climate change, because people lived off the land. Because their bodies are used to consuming meat, and their bodies are used to consuming fish. And when they eat too much sugar, their body's profoundly impacted by it. It just has a much more drastic impact than if you live in a tropical community or in a mid-latitude community. So people's bodies simply cannot handle sugar or carbohydrates as our bodies can. So that's a huge consequence of this modern way of living. So economically speaking, people are, they make more money than they ever did. They're well taken care of. Healthcare is better in general. It's more accessible. But at the same time, people are incredibly sick, literally speaking, physically sick because of the ways they're living. Because of all of this exposure to sugar in particular. It's the biggest pandemic in the Arctic is sugar.
I have a question. Me. Why did you decide to start your project with the Canadian Arctic? Why that special part of the world?
I have always been fascinated by Arctic environments. When I was a high school student, I had a map of Canada hanging on my wall, and I always dreamt of driving as far north as I could. I don't know where that particular affinity comes from, but I've always been drawn to the north and why people live in such harsh climates and how they survive there and how they make this kind of climate work. And I hadn't worked in Canada until 2019. I lived in Canada as a student in the 1990s, but I had never really gone that far north. There's a longer story why I'm particularly drawn to the Arctic, and it started with a festival, and it goes, it's this relationship between economy and culture that I also want to address a little bit here. So in 1995, I was a student in Canada, and I was done with my studies and I wanted to drive north, so I rented a car and I drove as far north as I could. And there was a hitchhiker that I picked up. Should have not done that, but he was nice. And we drove far north, and he was telling me about his music festival and said, let's go to this music festival, you can drive there. And it was on the Arctic Ocean in Canada, in Taktoyakta, a small community. And it was a Canadian beer company that was launching a new beer, and they wanted to advertise this beer by having this concert, this massive concert in the Canadian Arctic. Well, I didn't go to the concert, and I'm glad I didn't go because the concert was a disaster. There were, big bands like Metallica and a couple of other rock bands playing there, and there was clashes between the local community and the visitors that they were invited up there, and a filmmaker ended up making a film called The Invasion of the Beer People. Well, what's this story about? It is about this clash between culture and the economy. Here we have a large global beer company who had this strange idea that to release a new beer, to advertise for it, they should bring it into a community where no alcohol is consumed. It's illegal to drink alcohol in Taktoyakta because alcohol, sugar, and all these derivatives are in many cases deadly to the Inuit. So I'm really interested in that clash between culture and the economy. And how can we build economies that are respectful of local cultures? In this case, obviously it wasn't. So that was my first exposure with the Canadian Arctic and how southern companies are bringing things into the Arctic that shouldn't be there, like beer. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
Okay. So why did you decided to come here to Colombia?
Well,
yeah.
When we started the project in the Canadian Arctic, a colleague of mine that we were working with, who works for West Baffin Eskimo Cooperative, he knew Sophia and brought Sophia into our conversations, and the rest is history. So Sophia and a number of students from here actually participated in the online meetings, and then I applied for a grant to expand the project to other hemispheres, other climate environments, so not the Arctic, but a completely different climatic environment. And, I think it's really interesting that sort of by accident, we are now in an environment where we have the paramos here that are really the second fastest changing ecosystem in the world. So started with the fastest changing, moving on to the second fastest.
All right. Thank you so much for everything. From all of the GRULAC Junior team, we would like to thank you a lot because it was a great presentation, very insightful. And yes, thank you. And now we're moving on to the second part because it is almost time for us to go in a break. Entonces, voy a hablar un poquito yo antes y después Nicolás Gómez va a presentar la agenda y la presidenta de prensa va a hablar un poquito del proyecto de prensa que tiene GRULAC y les va a explicar rápidamente los protocolos de COVID. Y después voy a hacer un pequeñito cierre, ¿ok? Entonces quería empezar por recordarles a todos por qué estamos aquí el día de hoy. Quería hacerlo recordando las palabras del jefe Ciaro, que era una tribu indígena que vivía en Washington, y lo que le contesta al presidente de los Estados Unidos cuando él le dice que quiere comprar sus tierras, y es: tenéis que saber que cada trozo de esta tierra es sagrado para mi pueblo, cada aguja de un abeto, cada playa de arena,
cada niebla en la profundidad de los bosques, cada claro entre los árboles, cada insecto que zumba es sagrado para el pensar y sentir de mi pueblo. La savia que sube por los árboles es sagrada experiencia y memoria de mi gente. Así se concebía el respeto por la tierra de los indígenas hace más de un siglo, y cada día nos aportamos más de ella, creyéndonos amos y dioses de la tierra. Este es un grito de ayuda que hacemos a los jóvenes, para que sean conscientes de lo que está ocurriendo con nuestro planeta. Destruimos, pensando que somos transformadores, actuando ante la imponencia de la tierra. En 2017, la ONU reveló que 12.6 millones de personas morían cada año por la degradación ambiental. Esto es inaceptable. Es momento de actuar responsablemente y parar de aceptar las propuestas que nos venden los gobiernos de cosas que son amigables para el medio ambiente. Debemos actuar y pararnos firmemente ante lo que pasa en el planeta. Concluyo con un último mensaje del gobernador de Seattle, de hace 164 años. ¿Dónde está el bosque espeso? Desapareció. ¿Qué ha sido del águila? Desapareció. Así se acaba la vida y solo nos queda el recurso de intentar sobrevivir. Muchas gracias a todos y ahora Nicolás Gómez presentará la agenda del día y de la semana.
Listo. Entonces, voy a presentar rápidamente la agenda de estos 3 días, cómo va a funcionar el orden del día y demás cosas. Entonces, pues ya ahorita que terminamos la inauguración, que es el evento en el que estamos, tenemos un pequeño refrigerio que va a ocurrir todos los días a las 10:30 de la mañana. A las 11 entramos a nuestra primera sesión de trabajo en la que tienen que básicamente plantear sus enfoques y sus objetivos de comisión. De 12 a 1 tenemos un almuerzo, de 1 a 2:30 la segunda sesión de trabajo, y finalizamos con un taller preparado por los estudiantes del Colegio Haciendo Alcaparros sobre las estadísticas del cambio climático. Mañana, día 2, miércoles, vamos a continuar pues con una bienvenida de 8:30 a 9, igual que hoy, un poco más corta. De 9 a 10:30 ya comenzamos con sesiones de trabajo, entrando más a fondo en los temas que se van a tocar en GRULAC Junior. Ya la idea es que para esa sesión tengan claro qué va a suceder, cuáles son los temas que se van a debatir, cuál es el enfoque que le quieren dar al tema de su comisión. Después otra vez, de 10:30 a 11 el refrigerio, de 11 a 12 una última sesión de trabajo del día, el almuerzo, y tenemos un taller de Río Bogotá que va a ocurrir en el lago del colegio, en el que básicamente van a explicar cómo funcionan estos ríos de Bogotá, estas aguas que rodean toda la ciudad, y acabamos a las 2:30, el miércoles salimos una hora más temprano. Y para terminar, el jueves tenemos la misma bienvenida de 8:30 a 9, de 9 a 10:30 la sesión de trabajo número 5, en la que la idea es que ya comiencen a escribir sus papeles resolutivos, los proyectos, demás. El refrigerio de 10:30 a 11. La sesión de trabajo 6 de 11 a 12, en la que la idea es que en esta sesión de trabajo 6 y en esta sesión de trabajo 7 cierren el comité, dejando una propuesta o un proyecto pendiente para cumplir después de GRULAC. El objetivo de GRULAC es, más allá de sentarse a debatir y más allá de simplemente llegar a una solución, escribirla y guardar el papel en un archivo, que el proyecto sea viable y que las situaciones sean factibles, ¿sí? Entonces, sesión de trabajo 6 de 11 a 12 del día, un almuerzo de 12 a 1, y de 1 a 2 de la tarde cerramos comisiones para de 2 a 3:45 estar en el cierre del modelo. Y ya, ese es el orden del día. Ahora va a hablar la líder de prensa y les va a explicar un poco sobre los parámetros de COVID y demás. Muchas gracias.
Buenos días, delegados. Entonces, básicamente el objetivo de prensa es compartir con ustedes esta semana. Van a salir varios productos en los cuales vamos a llegar a conocerlos más, videos, textos, boletines, en los cuales vamos a reportar todo lo que va a estar pasando durante la semana. Por otro lado, básicamente por normas gubernamentales y nacionales debe haber uso obligatorio del tapabocas en espacios cerrados y en la cafetería. Además, antes de entrar a las instalaciones del colegio todas las mañanas, deben llenar una encuesta de COVID que se les mandó a todos sus correos electrónicos. Además de esto, les voy a informar dónde van a estar localizadas las comisiones. Entonces, Jaguares va a estar en F202, todos los primeros salones que voy a mencionar
jaguares, F202, ríos, océanos y costas, F203, políticas ambientales y relaciones internacionales, F204, género, F205, ciudades sostenibles, F206, biodiversidad en riesgo, F207, producción y consumo responsable, F208, y crisis, que va a estar en el Salón de las Sillas Rojas. Este salón queda al costado derecho, al fondo, en el primer piso, al lado de la biblioteca de bachillerato. Cualquier otra inquietud o problema que tengan, pueden consultarlo con sus mesas directivas o con alguien de logística. Muchas gracias.
Qué valora. Ok, ya para cerrar, unos pequeños anuncios. Queremos primero que todo saludar a Perú, Costa Rica y México, que nos acompañan virtualmente. Y les queremos decir que cualquier inquietud o información que tengamos las vamos a mandar más tarde por el correo electrónico. Ahora vamos a ir a la cafetería, a un pequeño refrigerio, y después van a ir todos a sus mesas y a sus comisiones para continuar con el día. Muchas gracias.